I want to thank Pastors Robert Morris and Steve Dullen. They're great people. Great people with a great reputation, I have to say that. Great reputation.
In a letter dated February 6th, 2007, Robert Morris's lawyer wrote that it was your client who initiated the inappropriate behavior by entering my client's room and lying on his bed. This correspondence had already identified the client as being 12 years old at the time of the events. In 2023, Robert Morris was the founding pastor of the 9th largest Christian church in the United States, leader of an organization with an annual revenue of $100 million, author of 14 books, and an evangelical advisor to a president. When the accusations became public in June of 2024, the Board of Elders declared they were devastated and horrified to learn that what we believed to be an extramarital affair was allegedly the abuse of a child. This statement was made by people who received emails in 2005, explicitly confirming that the victim was 12 years old. What this investigation tracks is not just what one man did. It's how an entire institution, for nearly 4 decades, worked to ensure no one had to answer for it. On December 25th, 1982, Cindy Clemishire was 12 years old, wore pink floral pajamas, and still played with Barbie dolls. It was Christmas in Hominy, Oklahoma, and the Clemishire family home had a guest, Robert Morris, 21 years old, married, father of a newborn baby, an itinerant preacher who traveled through churches in Texas and Oklahoma and stayed in the homes of the families where he preached. That night, according to the criminal indictment, Morris entered Cindy's room, touched her breasts and underneath her underwear. This was the first of more than 100 incidents of sexual abuse that would extend over the next 4.5 years in 2 states as the girl grew up and the preacher continued to build his career. 42 years later, Robert Morris sat in a courtroom in Osage County, Oklahoma, and pleaded guilty to 5 criminal charges of lewd and indecent acts with a child. The combined maximum sentence was 100 years in prison. Morris received 6 months in a county jail. That same day, as Cindy Clemishire read her victim impact statement directly to the man who abused her when she was 12 years old, Morris kept his head down during the entire reading. According to multiple witnesses present in the courtroom, he never looked up. He never faced her. This is the starting point of this investigation. Not because it is just a story of abuse, although it is that first and foremost, and needs to be called what it is. It is the starting point because to understand the scale of the case, one must understand who Robert Morris was when this story finally reached the public. And to understand the cover-up, one must understand the size of the institution that had an interest in protecting him, and the instruments that institution used for decades to keep the case out of the public domain. In 2023, Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas, was the 9th largest Christian church in the United States, with more than 25,000 weekly attendees, 11 campuses in 3 states, and an annual revenue of approximately $100 million. Morris had 14 published books. His television program, The Blessed Life, reached about 100 million homes in the United States and was broadcast in 190 countries. His radio program was in more than 6,800 cities. In 2016, Morris joined Donald Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board. In June of 2020, Trump personally visited Gateway Church and publicly declared, "They are great people with a great reputation." Morris's estimated net worth reached $117 million, supported by properties that included a mansion in Colleyville, valued at $8 million, a 370-acre ranch in Jacksboro, and a residence in a community considered by Forbes to be the richest in America. Look at the contrast. While Morris built all this, the campuses, the books, the national evangelical conferences, the political partnerships, Cindy Clemishire dropped out of college, went through multiple divorces, and battled depression and self-esteem issues that she attributes to what happened when she was 12 years old. In court on October 2nd, 2025, she said directly to Morris, "While you were building a megachurch, publishing books, and gaining fame, I dropped out of college, endured divorces, struggled with self-esteem, battled depression, made countless bad decisions, and added more shame to my life." This is the central asymmetry of this case. An institution grew and prospered, while the victim alone carried the consequences of what its founder did to her when she was a child. The abuse was made possible by a specific mechanism. Morris was not a stranger to the Clemishire family. He was a figure of spiritual authority within that community. He would arrive as a guest preacher, stay in their home, and be received with the trust and respect that a religious leader received in that context. This mechanism, spiritual trust as an instrument of access, is not a side detail of the story. It is the structure that made the abuse possible and the silence easier to maintain for decades. And it is the same type of authority that the institution later used to manage what was released to the public. The spiritual position serves not only to open doors, it also serves to close them. The abuse was not episodic or brief. According to the criminal indictment, it occurred in more than 100 separate incidents in Texas and Oklahoma, whenever Morris's travels brought him near the family. As Cindy grew older, Morris allegedly tried to advance to sexual intercourse. In her own words, the entire experience was emotionally, spiritually, physically, and psychologically manipulative. 4.5 years of abuse against a child who entered adolescence while the man responsible continued to circulate in churches, be welcomed into family homes, and build his reputation as a man of God. In 1987, at about 16 or 17 years old, Cindy told her parents what had happened. Her father confronted Morris directly and threatened to call the police. Morris agreed to leave the ministry. The case was brought to the elders of Shady Grove Church in Grand Prairie, Texas, where Morris was affiliated with Pastor Olin Griffing. The institutional decision was to conduct a, quote, 2-year restoration process. In practice, Morris returned to the pulpit in approximately 1 month, not in 24 months, in 1. This detail documents the difference between what the institution announced to itself and what the institution effectively did when it weighed the preacher's career against the abuse of a child. For almost 18 years, Cindy Clemishire carried the weight of the abuse without criminal proceedings, public exposure, or formal consequences for the man who abused her. There was no police investigation. There was no accountability beyond that symbolic 1-month-long leave of absence. Morris founded Gateway Church in 2000, expanded campuses throughout Texas and beyond, and accumulated platform, influence, and wealth. The Gateway Conference would become one of the largest national evangelical events. Gateway Worship would release recordings distributed throughout the country. The institution that in 1987 declared to itself that it had closed the case simply moved on as if the chapter were closed. The victim did not participate in this closure and was not consulted about it. In 2005, Clemishire sent emails to Gateway leaders detailing the abuse. Elder Tom Lane received and responded to this communication. In this exchange, Lane explicitly confirmed that she was 12 years old on December 25, 1982. This is a documented fact, an email with a date, with content, and with a written response. Other elders and media executives at Gateway also received communications with the full details of what had occurred. It was not a vague rumor, not an ambiguous allegation. It was put in writing, with the victim's age explicitly identified, and it reached the inboxes of people who held formal leadership positions within an organization that grossed tens of millions of dollars a year. The institutional response to this new revelation was an attempt to buy silence. In 2007, Morris's lawyer, J. Shelby Sharp, offered Clemishire $25,000 in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, that would prevent her from speaking about the abuse. Clemishire refused. But what was documented in this negotiation reveals how the institution viewed the problem. In the letter dated February 6, 2007, Morris's lawyer wrote, "It was your client who initiated the inappropriate behavior by entering my client's room and lying on his bed, which my client should not have allowed to happen." This sentence was written in correspondence that had already explicitly identified the victim as being 12 years old at the time of the events. The chosen legal strategy was to assign responsibility to the child for the adult's sexual behavior. Look at what the documents show about the extent of knowledge within the organization. In 2007, in addition to the emails and the attempted NDA, Morris himself drafted a proposed announcement about the situation. An internal memo from Gateway leadership instructed Morris to not mention the family or Cindy by name. Jimmy Evans, founder of the ministry Marriage Today, one of the most recognized figures in North American evangelism and an apostolic elder of Gateway, participated in a meeting that year where the details of the abuse were discussed directly. In 2011, Morris drafted a second announcement with specific details about what had occurred. New emails were sent to the elders. Evans was aware in his formal capacity. This is a documentary trail that runs from 2005 to 2011, with names, dates, and written correspondence. Gateway Church was not a small congregation managed informally. It was an organization with hired lawyers, a structured board of elders, a communications department, and a national brand to protect. The decision not to make the case public, not to notify authorities, to try to buy the victim's silence with an agreement that still tried to hold her responsible for the abuse. This decision was not made out of carelessness or lack of information. It was made actively by people with access to the complete documentation within an institution with all the resources to act differently. And this is where the scheme becomes truly sophisticated in its internal contradiction. Throughout this period, Robert Morris was building a national reputation based on messages of integrity, generosity, and authentic spiritual life. His most famous book, The Blessed Life, reached millions of readers with a message about giving and receiving within faith. In a 2014 sermon, decades after the abuse and years after multiple Gateway leaders already knew the facts, Morris told his congregation that he had learned to lie and manipulate when he was young, and that he looked for the girls who would be most susceptible. The phrase was delivered as a testimony of personal overcoming. In light of the documents, it carries a different weight. On June 14, 2024, the investigative website, the Wartburg Watch, published Cindy Clemishire's full account. The next day, Morris issued a public statement. It said, "When I was in my early 20s, I engaged in inappropriate sexual behavior with a young lady in a house where I was staying. It was kissing and touching, not intercourse, but it was wrong." With no mention of the fact that the victim was 12 years old, without using the word child. The choice of young lady to describe a 12-year-old child was not careless language. It was a deliberate framing that transformed 4.5 years of abuse initiated against a child into an impropriety between adults. 3 days later, on June 18, 2024, the Board of Elders issued its statement accepting Morris's resignation. In it, the elders wrote that they were devastated and horrified to learn that what we believed to be an extramarital affair was allegedly the abuse of a child. They added that before June 14th, the elders did not have all the facts of the inappropriate relationship between Morris and the victim, including her age at the time and the duration of the abuse. This claim of ignorance is directly contradicted by Tom Lane's 2005 email confirming she was 12, by the 2007 memo, by the meeting with Jimmy Evans that same year, and by the 2011 documents. The distance between what the statement claimed and what the records show is not a matter of interpretation. It is a verifiable contradiction with dates, names, and written documentation. What the institution presented to the public as a moment of discovery and shock was in reality the third or fourth time the same organization had dealt with the same set of facts. The difference was that this time, the story reached the public before the institution could manage the narrative. And the immediate response, Morris's statement, the elders' communique, revealed the pattern that had worked for almost 20 years. Minimize the abuse, control the framing of the victim, and claim ignorance of facts that were in the organization's own internal files. What changed in June of 2024 is that those files were about to become evidence in criminal and civil proceedings that the institution would no longer be able to control, because investigators were already at work. And the documents Gateway had kept for decades were about to be read aloud in a court of law. Oklahoma's Attorney General Gentner Drummond chose a legal strategy that few expected to work. For a decades-old case where the facts had occurred between 1982 and 1987, most lawyers would have dismissed the feasibility of a criminal prosecution based on the statute of limitations. Drummond pursued another path, a territorial law from Oklahoma's pre-statehood era that tolls the statute of limitations when the defendant commits a crime in the state but is not a resident. Since Morris was based in Texas during the entire period of the abuse and never established residency in Oklahoma, the statute of limitations technically never ran. On March 12, 2025, Oklahoma's multi-county grand jury formalized the indictment. 5 charges of lewd or indecent acts with a child. 5 separate charges for a pattern of abuse that lasted more than 4 years and accumulated more than 100 documented incidents. The total combined exposure was 100 years in prison. Pay attention to this point. The decision to use that specific law was not just a procedural maneuver. It was a message about what the legal system was saying about the response the institution had given for decades. A.G. Drummond was direct when he announced the indictment. There can be no tolerance for those who sexually prey on children. The victim in this case has waited far too long for justice to be served. The state of Oklahoma was not waiting for Gateway Church to manage the case internally. It was using the oldest available legal instrument to reach a man who had built an entire empire 500 kilometers away and never formally answered for what he did to a child from that state. On March 17, 2025, Robert Morris turned himself in to Oklahoma authorities, was photographed, booked, and released within minutes. On May 9th, he entered the courtroom and pleaded not guilty to all 5 charges. For months, his defense maintained the position of fighting the charges. Then, on October 2nd, 2025, something changed. Morris reversed his plea and admitted guilt on all 5 charges in the Osage County District Court in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. The sentence the judge delivered was as follows: 10 years in prison, suspended with conditions, and 6 effective months in the Osage County Jail. Lifetime registration as a sex offender. Supervision by Texas authorities via an interstate compact. Restitution of $270,000 to Cindy Clemishire. Look at what the numbers reveal when placed in context. 5 criminal charges for abuse initiated against a 12-year-old child continued for 4.5 years, with more than 100 incidents recorded in 2 states, and the effective sentence was 6 months in a county jail. To get an idea of what this means in practice, an assistant pastor in a comparable case, convicted of repeated abuse of a teenager, received 13 years in prison. A former youth pastor who abused 2 girls received 33 months in federal prison. Morris's sentence was widely treated by legal analysts and by groups protecting victims of religious abuse as exceptional leniency. The difference between the maximum legal exposure, 100 years, and the 6 effective months represents one of the largest documented contrasts in comparable cases of child abuse by religious authority figures in recent years. While the criminal case ran its course, the civil front opened new flanks that Gateway could not control. On June 13, 2025, Cindy Clemishire and her father, Jerry Lee Clemishire, filed a $1 million defamation lawsuit in Dallas County District Court in Texas. The list of defendants is revealing. Robert Morris, Debbie Morris, his wife, and Gateway Church itself, but also by name 8 elders of the institution: Thomas Miller, Jeremy Carrasco, Kevin Grove, Galen Lawshe, Traw Wilbanks, Kenneth Fambro, Dane Miner, and Steve Doolin. The Clemishire's legal strategy was not just to sue the founder. It was to name one by one the men who held formal leadership positions and who, according to the lawsuit, actively participated in the cover-up or benefited financially from the structure that made it possible. The central allegations of the lawsuit go beyond the abuse itself. The Clemishires accuse the defendants of having made knowingly false statements to minimize the severity of what occurred, of having conducted an active cover-up for decades, of having defamed Cindy Clemishire when she came forward publicly, and of having profited financially from maintaining this structure of silence. The last allegation is particularly important because it connects the dimension of the cover-up to the financial dimension of the organization. The argument is not just that Gateway protected Morris out of loyalty or religious conviction. It is that the institution had a direct financial interest in keeping the founder in place, because the founder was the brand that generated the $100 million annually in tithes and offerings. And here enters an element that changes everything in this story. The tithe fraud lawsuit, filed in October of 2024 as a class action in the U.S. District Court in Sherman, Texas, alleges that Gateway Church systematically told its members that 15% of tithes, which would amount to about $15 million a year on a revenue of $100 million, would be allocated to global missions. The plaintiff is a CPA, a certified public accountant, who managed Gateway's global ministries between 2011 and 2014. This professional testified that in none of the years he was in charge of the work did he see more than $3 million actually distributed. The gap between the promised $15 million and the actual $3 million is, in absolute terms, $12 million a year. Money given by families who believed they were funding missions, and that, according to the lawsuit, remained within the organization. The financial numbers surrounding Robert Morris personally reinforce the issue. The IRS Form 990 filings, the mandatory tax returns for nonprofit organizations in the United States, show that between 2017 and 2018, Morris received approximately $350,000 a year from his own evangelistic association, a separate organization from Gateway, that in that same period recorded total revenue of only $211,000. This means the organization was paying Morris more than it collected. In 2022, he received $200,000 a year from the same organization for, according to the formal record, 15 hours of work per week. This is independent of payments from Gateway Church itself, independent of royalties from books and television and radio programs. The money flowed through multiple channels with separate structures, and there is no public indication that the congregation members understood the complexity of this financial architecture. After the scandal became public, Morris still tried to negotiate the terms of his exit. Gateway revealed that he had alleged a verbal promise from the elders to receive $800,000 a year until he turned 70, and then $600,000 a year after that, as a retirement package. The actual written agreement was for $170,000 a year for 20 years. Morris demanded more than $1 million in a lump sum payment from the retirement account. Gateway rejected the demand, and the case went to arbitration. This is not a minor detail. This is a man who had just resigned amidst decades-long child sexual abuse allegations, trying to negotiate an exit package that exceeded, in a single payment, the annual salary of hundreds of families who regularly tithed to his megachurch. The effect on the institution was immediate and measurable. By November of 2024, 5 months after the scandal became public, Gateway's tithes had dropped by 35 to 40%. The total weekly attendance fell from about 25,000 to approximately 19,000 people, a reduction of more than 20%. At the main Southlake campus, the heart of the operation, the drop reached 40%. The institution went through 2 rounds of layoffs, affecting approximately 25% of the staff, out of a total of about 550. Saturday services were canceled at all campuses except Southlake. 4 elders were fired. By December of 2024, the Board of Elders was reduced to just 3 active members. The annual Gateway Conference, one of the biggest events on the national evangelical calendar, was canceled. Because, let's be honest, what these numbers describe is the partial collapse of an institution built on a promise of moral authority. When the moral authority is invalidated by the founder, the organizational structure that depended on that authority begins to disintegrate. Congregants who donated regularly based on the spiritual trust that Gateway represented had to recalibrate all that trust at once. Employees who built careers within the institution lost their jobs without having made any decision that caused the problem. Longtime members faced the embarrassment of explaining to their own families and communities why they continued or stopped continuing to attend a church whose founder had pleaded guilty to child sexual abuse. The systemic pattern is revealed when one looks at the ramifications beyond Gateway's walls. Brady Boyd served at Gateway between 2001 and 2007 under Morris's direct leadership. He later became the senior pastor of New Life Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Curiously, the same congregation devastated by the Ted Haggard scandal in 2006. Boyd had appointed Morris as a spiritual overseer of New Life. When Morris's case became public in June of 2024, Boyd claimed he did not know the victim was 12 years old. The New Life Board of Elders reviewed the available evidence and reached another conclusion. It determined that Boyd had lied about what he knew. In June of 2025, Boyd was forced to resign, along with 2 other executive pastors of New Life. A single cover-up structure, exported for decades through networks of mentorship and affiliation, generated institutional consequences in at least 2 megachurches in 2 different states. Jimmy Evans deserves specific attention because his case documents the distance between what public figures in American evangelism publicly claimed and what documents show they knew privately. Evans is the founder of Marriage Today, one of the most well-known family counseling ministries in the United States with a national reach. As an apostolic elder of Gateway, he participated in a meeting in 2007 where the full details of the abuse were discussed, including the victim's age. In 2011, he was aware of a document Morris drafted with specific information about what had occurred. When the case became public in June of 2024, Evans publicly stated that he was shocked and that Morris had described the episode only as an affair with a woman. The documents from 2007 and 2011 directly contradict this narrative. Evans is one of the defendants in the civil lawsuit filed by the Clemishires. The response of other evangelical leaders to the case also says something about the institutional environment that made the cover-up possible. In February of 2026, Landon Schott, pastor of Mercy Culture Church in Texas, visited Morris in the Osage County Jail and posted a selfie taken outside with the caption, "Religious people are not going to like this post." Schott declared on social media that God had forgiven Morris. When abuse survivors and critics responded to the post, Schott called the critics demonic, carriers of foul religious spirits, and vipers. This episode is not just a social media curiosity. It documents a recurring institutional reflex in closed religious structures. When a member of the network is held accountable, the pressure turns against those who demand accountability. Now, why does this matter beyond the individuals involved? Because what this investigation exposes is a model of operation, not an exception. The structure that protected Morris for almost 40 years included a centralized religious hierarchy that allowed for the internal suppression of complaints, private legal instruments like NDAs that transferred legal risk to the victim while protecting the institution, multiple financial channels that obscured the movement of resources and hindered external auditing, affiliation networks that exported the culture of leader protection to other institutions, and a total absence of independent oversight over how tithes were collected and distributed. This model did not start at Gateway. It will not end with it. And it works precisely because the institutions that employ it build their legitimacy on the premise that they do not need external oversight, because their authority already comes from a source superior to any human audit. As of March of 2026, the $1 million defamation civil suit remained active, with a trial scheduled for June 15th, 2026, exactly 2 years after the date the scandal became public. The class action lawsuit for tithe fraud survived dismissal attempts and continues to proceed in federal court in Texas. Church Mutual Insurance, Gateway's insurer, asked the court to declare that it has no obligation to cover the defense costs in the defamation lawsuit, which, if granted, would place the financial burden of the litigation generated by the cover-up directly on the congregation's resources. And on March 17, 2026, the Oklahoma House of Representatives passed the Cindy Clemishire Act with a vote of 88-0, a law that would make any NDA intended to cover up child sexual abuse unenforceable and would eliminate the statute of limitations for this type of crime. Passed unanimously. 39 years after that first Christmas in Hominy, Oklahoma. What still has no answer is perhaps the most relevant question beyond the individuals named in the lawsuits. How many other institutions maintain similar files, with similar emails, with similar memos, with similar NDA attempts, and never had a Cindy Clemishire who refused to sign? The structure documented in this case did not require extraordinary complicity. It only required people in positions of authority to make ordinary choices within a system that rewarded silence, punished exposure, and ensured that the cost of speaking was always greater than the cost of being silent. Morris will be granted parole around Easter weekend of 2026, approximately. The civil lawsuits will continue. The laws created in Clemishire's name will continue to move through the Texas and Oklahoma legislatures. And what the documents have already revealed, regardless of any outcome still pending, is that the cover-up was not a failure of the system. It was the system working exactly as it had been built to work. The cover-up documented in this case did not require extraordinary complicity. It required people in positions of authority making predictable choices within a system that rewarded silence and punished exposure. How many other victims signed what Cindy Clemishire refused? That is the cost that no lawsuit will ever measure. To follow the next investigations, subscribe to the channel and consider becoming a member to support this work closely.